Well, good morning, everybody. My name's Mike. I'll be your preacher today. We are continuing our series in the book of Mark, and so pretty soon we are going to crack open Mark chapter 14 and kind of hit the second half of that chapter. So if you want to put your finger in the page on your Bible, you could do that. The title of the message today is Been There, Done That, Bought the T-shirt. When I was thinking about this phrase, there's one particular shirt I thought of that I have, and it is this one. Can anyone represent? Yes. That's right, yes, the Saskatchewan Roughriders. I bought the T-shirt because I've been there, and I've done that. I grew up in Regina. Anyone with me? Yes! Woo! Merck family at the back, yeah. I grew up in Regina, and then for a couple of years, Lynn and I and Faith and Jaira, right before Ellie was born, we lived in Caronport, Saskatchewan for a couple of years. And whenever I meet someone from Saskatchewan, there's kind of this knowing glance that goes between us because we've shared the same suffering. We've been there when it's minus 50 with the wind chill, and the weather report actually gives you a timeline of how long exposed skin can be outside before you freeze. Like, if it's a 30-second day, then you got to be really careful. If it's like a minute or 2 minutes, you're all right. And so when you meet other people from Saskatchewan, it's like, yeah, I get you. You know, I've been outside when you inhale and you can feel your nose hairs freezing. I've driven on the snow, and so like when we got 2 inches out here, everyone's panicking, the city shuts down, and people from Saskatchewan are like, yeah, whatever. I learned to drive in that. I mean, I was doing donuts on my residential street every morning going to school and stuff like that. It was fine. Everything's great. Only had a few accidents. It's good. But the biggest thing is right here. It's the riders. And, you know, I've seen people with the hat, the rider's hat, like all over the world. We went to Disneyland, and I saw someone wearing a rider's hat, looked at them. They looked at me, I said, "Go Riders!" Looked at me, he's like, "Yeah, go Riders!" Because, you know, that's another thing we share in Saskatchewan, is this fanatical dedication to sometimes second-rate, sometimes pretty good CFL football team, because it's the only show in Saskatchewan. It's the only thing there. And so when the Riders are doing good, everyone is on board. When they're doing bad, everyone's still on board, because that's all we have. And that's how it works. But the phrase "Go Riders" kind of conveys this unspoken connection. You know, if I can see somebody buying the green washer fluid at the co-op with the Riders logo on it, look at them, say, "Go Riders." And basically that means I get you. You get me. We understand. We're on the same team here. We bleed green. We know what it is to be in Saskatchewan. And so that's what I thought of when I thought of the phrase "been there, done that, bought the T-shirt," because it really helps to draw those connections with people, to know they've been where you've been. They understand the pain that you've been through. They understand the realities of your life. And there's an instant bond that's formed there. And that's what I want to talk about this morning as we're looking into the book of Mark, because Jesus has been there. He's done that. He bought the T-shirt. I'm pretty sure he's a Riders fan. Pretty sure. We can find out in heaven. But we're going to look into Mark chapter 14 today. And in this passage, we're going to see how Jesus fits the bill, how he understands us. And so just to give us some context where we're at, we just finished the Last Supper. We talked about that 2 weeks ago. And then after the Last Supper, Jesus took his disciples out to a garden, to a park, an olive grove called the Garden of Gethsemane. And Jesus spent the night praying and in anguish, and the disciples thought this was a great opportunity for a nap. And then, this is like, I'm not sure, but I'm picturing like early in the morning, 5, 6 a.m., maybe. And they've been napping. Jesus has been praying all night. And then we pick up the story at verse 41. So we're going to read through this one. I'm going to read through the Message translation because it tells the story nicely. So Mark 14:41 says like this: Jesus came back a third time and said to his disciples, "Are you going to sleep all night? No, you've slept long enough. Time's up. The Son of Man is about to be betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up. Let's get going. My betrayer has arrived." No sooner were the words out of his mouth when Judas, the one of the 12, showed up, and with him a gang of ruffians sent by the high priests, religion scholars, and leaders, brandishing swords and clubs. The betrayer had worked out a signal with them. "The one I kiss, that's the one. Seize him. Make sure he doesn't get away." He went straight to Jesus and said, "Rabbi," and kissed him. The others then grabbed him and roughed him up. One of the men standing there unsheathed his sword, swung, and came down on the chief priest's servant, lopping off the man's ear. Other Gospels inform us that this was Peter. No big surprise there. Jesus said to them, "What is this, coming after me with swords and clubs as if I were a dangerous criminal? Day by day I've been sitting in the temple teaching, and you never so much as lifted a hand against me. What you in fact have done is confirm the prophetic writings." All the disciples cut and ran. They were out of there. A young man was following along. All he had on was a bedsheet. Some of the men grabbed him, but he got away, running off naked, leaving them holding the sheet. Isn't that a bizarre detail to include in that story? Like, it's just out of left field, isn't it? So I'm just going to take a little side note into Tangent Town, wave at Conrad on the way over there. And most scholars who read this think that this was actually Mark. The author of the Gospel of Mark was the young man who for some reason was out in a garden wearing a bedsheet and ran off buck naked in the middle of this conflict. And it's kind of weird, but I think this is Mark kind of saying, yeah, I was there. Been there, done that. I bought the bedsheet, and he was there. So why would Mark include this really embarrassing detail about himself in the gospel that he wrote? And I think one of the reasons why this was included was so that we can know that Mark is being authentic, that he's being real. He's not just making up this story, because if he was, he would be the one riding in there on a horse rescuing Jesus and saying, "Hold on, everybody, let's talk this through," right? Instead, he includes this really embarrassing detail about himself. And you know what? This is all through the Gospels. The disciples are numbskulls in the Gospels. They don't get it. And some people say that, well, the Bible was just made up. Somebody just, wrote this work of fiction to try to promote this religious teaching and put themselves as the heads of the church. Well, if they did that, why did they include details about themselves that cast them in such a bad light? Why did they write themselves as idiots in the Gospels? And it points to the fact that this is a genuine story. And the Gospel writers were concerned with telling the truth and not spinning it in a way that they looked good. And so I think little embarrassing, weird details like this can increase our confidence that the Bible is accurate and it's true, and the people that wrote it were doing it out of interest of telling the truth, and the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Okay, back to the text. They led Jesus to the high priest, or to the chief priest, where the high priests, religion leaders, and scholars had gathered together. Peter followed at a safe distance until they got to the chief priest's courtyard, where he mingled with the servants and warmed himself at the fire. The high priest, conspiring with the Jewish council, looked high and low for evidence against Jesus by which they could sentence him to death. They found nothing. Plenty of people were willing to bring in false charges, but nothing added up, and they ended up canceling each other out. Then a few of them stood up and lied. "We heard him say, 'I'm going to tear down this temple built by hard labor, and in 3 days build another without lifting a hand.'" But even they couldn't agree exactly. In the middle of this, the chief priest stood up and asked Jesus, "What do you have to say to the accusation?" Jesus was silent. He said nothing. The chief priest tried again, this time asking, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed?" Jesus said, "Yes, I am. And you'll see it yourself. The Son of Man seated at the right hand of the Mighty One, arriving on the clouds of heaven." The chief priest lost his temper. Ripping his clothes, he yelled, "Do you hear that? After that, do we need witnesses? You heard the blasphemy. Are you going to stand for it? They condemned him, one and all. The sentence? Death. Some of them started spitting at him. They blindfolded his eyes and hit him, saying, "Who hit you? Prophesy!" The guards, punching him and slapping him, took him away. While all of this was going on, Peter was down in the courtyard. One of the chief priest's servants' girls came in, and seeing Peter warming himself there, looked hard at him and said, "You were with the Nazarene, Jesus." He denied it. "I don't know what you're talking about." He went out to the porch. A rooster crowed. The girl spotted him and began telling the people standing around, "He's one of them!" He denied it again. After a little while, the bystanders brought it up again. "You've got to be one of them. You've got Galilean written all over you." Now Peter got really nervous, and he swore, "I never laid eyes on this man that you're talking about." Just then, the rooster crowed a second time. Peter remembered how Jesus had said, "Before a rooster crows twice, you'll deny me 3 times. He collapsed in tears. So there's a lot to unpack here. This is a pretty dense, full passage. But really, what it all comes down to is some bad times. These are some bad times for Jesus and some bad times for Peter, and it wasn't going really well. And this points to something I think that we've all experienced, that life isn't fair. There's hardships, there's suffering, there's bad times, and we've all experienced that. We're not promised a rose garden. Life in this world is tough. And Jesus was right in the middle of it. I mean, in our world, abuse is on the rise. The stats tell us that in the last 7 years, the reported cases of domestic abuse alone has risen every year for the last 7 years. And I think we all have some suffering and some pain, either in our past or our present, that we are carrying. And sometimes there's a misconception when we think about our suffering and our pain. And the misconception is that God is behind it. That God is somehow up there on his throne with the smite button on his computer, and he's mad at us, or we did something wrong, and so he's lined up all these hardships and all these trials and all these things that are designed to discourage us and knock us down, and God's just sitting back, crossing his arms, saying, "How do you like that? You little ants." And when we're underneath that, it can feel like God's picking on us. And it can feel like he is out to get us. And I know that there's a lot of people who have actually walked away from God and said, well, if God didn't stop that, I'm not going to follow him. Somehow he's responsible for my pain. And he's responsible for my suffering, and it's his fault, so I'm not going to follow him anymore. And I know that that's a lot of people's story. But that's not what the Bible teaches. The Bible does not give us that kind of picture of God, this vindictive, punishing God that's out to get us. Instead, the picture that the Bible gives us is a God who walks into our sorrows and into our pain and walks through those hard times by our side. He's the God that showed up in the fiery furnace with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and he was right there in the middle of the fire with them. That's our God. That's what he does. And he allows hard things to happen. He doesn't just make everything warm and fuzzy for everyone all the time, because he values free will. He wants people to genuinely be able to make their own choices, and with that comes genuine, unfiltered consequences, which results in a lot of pain for us. But the Bible shows us that God can take pain and suffering and hardship, and he can indwell that and turn that really bad stuff into good. He can bring good out of hard times. And there's no greater illustration than this, than the passage that we just read, because we know where it ends. We know that in the next chapter, Jesus dies a very unfair death. But the chapter after that, Jesus rises from the dead, and we can see everything that God did through that. And the big picture here is that Jesus went through all of that suffering and all that pain so that he could pay the penalty for our sins, so that he could forgive us. And he rose from the dead so that we could know him so that he's alive today. And all of that stuff had to happen so that we could know Jesus, so that we could get to go to heaven, so that we could be in that place where God will wipe away every tear from our eyes, where he will set everything right, where he will let justice be done. But he made the way through suffering. And just like God didn't abandon Jesus to his fate, he had a plan. God does not abandon us in our hardship and in our pain. We need to know that Jesus is familiar with sorrow and suffering. And that was a lot of the reason why Jesus went through everything that he did go through. He gets us. And the Bible says that all of this was part of the plan. This was something that Jesus willingly entered into. He knew the plan before he came to earth. He knew what was going on, and he knew that he would have to go through this. And God wrote down the plan 700 years before Jesus even showed up. There's this really cool passage in Isaiah chapter 53, which was written around 600 or 700 BC, that describes to a T what Jesus did, why he did it, and how it all unfolded. It's in Isaiah 53, verses 3 to 12. And it says this: "He was despised and rejected, a man of sorrows, acquainted with deepest grief. We turned our backs on him, and we looked the other way. He was despised, and we did not care. Yet it was our weaknesses he carried. It was our sorrows that weighed him down. And we thought his troubles were a punishment from God, a punishment for his own sins. But he was pierced for our rebellion, crushed for our sins. He was beaten so we could be whole. He was whipped so we could be healed. All of us, like sheep, have strayed away. We have left God's path to follow our own. Yet the Lord laid on him the sins of us all. He was oppressed and treated harshly, yet he never said a word. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep is silent before his shearers, he did not open his mouth. Unjustly condemned, he was led away. No one cared that he died without descendants, that his life was cut short in midstream. But he was struck down for the rebellion of my people. He had done no wrong and had never deceived anyone, but he was buried like a criminal. He was put in a rich man's grave. But it was the Lord's good plan to crush him and cause him grief. Yet, when his life is made an offering for sin, he will have many descendants." That's you and I. "He will enjoy a long life, and the Lord's good plan will prosper in his hands." He didn't stay dead. "When he sees all that is accomplished by his anguish, he will be satisfied. And because of his experience, my righteous servant will make it possible for many to be counted righteous, for he will bear all their sins. I will give him the honors of a victorious soldier because he exposed himself to death. He was counted among the rebels. He bore the sins of many and interceded for rebels." Isn't that awesome? This was written 700 years before Jesus even showed up. And it describes perfectly what he went through, why he went through it, and what the amazing good stuff God brought out of that. It's pretty phenomenal when you read these two passages side by side. And so this passage in Isaiah said it was God's will for Jesus to suffer. Now wait a minute. Didn't I just say that God doesn't cause our suffering? You see, God was playing the long game. He wasn't being vindictive here. He wasn't trying to punish Jesus, right? The passage in Isaiah brought that out as well. He wasn't being punished for his own sins. He was seeing the end from the beginning. And Jesus willingly stepped into that because he knew that your soul and my soul hung in the balance. If he didn't do this, if he didn't go through this, then we wouldn't have a hope. We would all be condemned to hell because there was no way for our sins to get paid for. So Jesus knew that it was worth it. Your soul and my soul was worth it for him to go through there. And the other thing that comes out of this, why he didn't just walk up and get somebody to crucify him, and, he died, or, he went through all the suffering also on purpose. And the reason for that is so he can show us that he gets it, that he understands. He understands what we go through. He understands what we're tempted with. He understands how we feel when these horrible things happen to us. He is on our side. And so I want to look through this passage, just kind of take a helicopter view over Mark 14 and into 15, and discover all the things that Jesus understands, all the things that he gets. First thing, his friends, they slept while he suffered with worry and anxiety. If you've ever suffered from worry and anxiety, if you've ever stayed up all night worrying about something, Jesus has done that. He understands what that feels like. Jesus' close friend betrayed him to be condemned. Judas was one of the inner circle. He was one of the 12. And he betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. Have you ever been betrayed by a friend? Had somebody turn on you? Jesus knows what that's like. All his friends left him in the dust. Jesus was left alone in the hardest hour of his life, the hardest portion of his life. All his friends left. Ever felt like you're all alone? Nobody cares? Jesus knows that. A whole bunch of people lied about Jesus. They twisted his words. They turned around the things that he said and made it appear that he was saying something totally different. You ever been misquoted by somebody? I remember one time I talked with somebody who wanted to be one of our youth leaders. And she was pretty unstable, and drama kind of followed in her wake. And so I left a voicemail with her saying, I don't think this is the right fit for you right now. I don't think you should be one of our youth volunteers right now. And then she told everybody that Lynn and I had pulled her aside in person and told her that she was kicked out of the church and could never show her face around Metro Kids or Surrey CLA again, and we really hated her. And she was telling everybody that. Happened to Jesus too. It happens, right? Okay, the people that should have been Jesus' biggest support, the religious leaders, the whole religious establishment who was looking for the Messiah to come, that was their job as Jewish religious leaders, they didn't recognize him. They condemned him. They didn't recognize who he was. Has anyone misunderstood you ever? What your motives are? Jesus knows that. Jesus was spat on and beat up by a gang of bullies. He was surrounded by soldiers with clubs and whips and fists. And they were spitting on him and kicking him and calling him down. Ever been hurt physically by somebody? Jesus knows what that feels like. Peter, Jesus' closest disciple, denied him 3 times that he even knew him. Yeah, that's some pretty harsh betrayal, isn't it? I thought it was bad when my buddy in grade 8 said to me, "I'm sorry, I can't walk to school with you anymore because you're not cool enough." I thought that was betrayal. Jesus experienced something else. And beyond today's passage, going into the next chapter, Jesus was falsely convicted and beaten. There's people who have suffered jail time for years and years and years, and they were innocent. Jesus knows what that feels like. Jesus was mocked. They just pointed the finger and laughed at him and made fun of him and put him up for public ridicule. He knows what that feels like. When people mock you on social media or, things like that, Jesus knows what that feels like. He was stripped publicly. He was naked on that cross. He was hanging there for everybody to see with no clothes on. Jesus knows that shame. He knows that humiliation. He knows what it feels like to be violated in that way. He's been there. He was insulted by everybody. Even the criminals beside him were throwing insults at him. And he felt abandoned by God. Have you ever felt abandoned by God in the middle of your sorrow? So did Jesus. And if anyone shouldn't have felt that. It's Jesus, right? Because he's so close with the Father. But when he was hanging on that cross, he cried out, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" He wasn't just reading off the script. That was from the depths of his heart. That's how he felt. And so when you've been there, Jesus feels that too. And he was killed like a criminal. He was strung up and died. So we can't say to God, "You don't know what it's like." We can't say to Jesus, "You don't know my suffering. You don't know how I'm feeling right now." He does. He hit every category, maybe not every exact thing that has happened to people, but every category, Jesus has felt it in one way or another. He fully entered into humanity and into our suffering and into our pain so that he can look us in the eye and say, "Yeah, I know how you feel. I understand. I get that." And because of that, we can get this verse in Hebrews 4 that Pastor Mark read for us this morning. "For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin." That's pretty big, right? Jesus didn't sin in all of this. He didn't mess up. He didn't respond badly. And so he becomes our example of how to respond to hardship, because he understands what it's like to be rejected and abused and misinterpreted, misunderstood, rejected. He understands emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse. And when he went through all of it, he didn't sin. And just in this little passage in Mark, we have this great contrast of Peter. Peter went through some of the stuff that Jesus went through, and he responded badly, didn't he? Like, his first instinct was to whip out a sword and cut off somebody's ear when he was being threatened, right? And then later, at the end of the passage, Peter's response is full self-preservation. He's afraid that he's going to be strung up too, and so he distances himself from Jesus as much as possible, calling down curses and denying that he ever knew Jesus. That's the wrong way to respond to suffering. But Peter was after revenge. He was taking his own revenge, and he was trying to preserve himself, and he was looking out for himself. Jesus responded differently. This is what Jesus' heart through this whole thing was. Not, "I want your will to be done, not mine." And so Jesus knew that through all this thing, the top priority for him was doing God's will, making sure that God's will was done. And that was his main focus in the middle of all the suffering. He was concerned with doing God's will, and he refused to take personal revenge. In fact, he stepped in, healed the guy's ear, and brought peace to this really highly charged situation. Jesus wasn't concerned with defending his reputation, right? He kept his mouth shut in front of his accusers. Now, that's not always the Christian thing to do, right? Jesus knew that there was a goal on the other side of that, and he knew that he was fulfilling prophecy by keeping his mouth shut. But there's times that we need to speak up, right? I don't want to say or be heard that being a Christian means you're a doormat and you just let people abuse you and let people hurt you. No, that's not it at all. If you've been hurt, if you've been abused, if you've been violated in any way, then you need to speak up. You need to stand up for your rights. You need to pursue justice. But not out of a need to get even, not out of a need for revenge, but out of just respect for yourself and respect for the fact that you're made in God's image, and when somebody violates that, then they should be held to account. But we can't put these things in our own hands. We've got to put them in God's hands. Leave the battle to God. That's what Romans 12 says. "Do not take revenge, my friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it's written, 'It is mine to avenge, I will repay.'" So Jesus wasn't after his own gain, his own pride, his own agenda. He wanted to do God's will. And he endured through all that suffering with the strength of God. He experienced God walking with him through all the hardship, even when he couldn't feel it on the cross. But God was walking with him through the whole thing. So the big takeaway for today is this, that Jesus understands you. He understands what you're going through, what you have gone through. He fully knows the pain that is in your heart, and he gets it. And so if anything comes out of today, I'm praying that if there's something in you that has been pushing God away because you think it's somehow his fault, that you tear down that wall and just run to him. Just run to him, because he knows, and he's there. So don't let that pain separate you from God. Let it be the catalyst to run you to him and get you into his arms. Hebrews 4:16 says, "Let us then approach the throne of grace with confidence so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need."